So let's kick off the first session, and it is a great pleasure to introduce Andrew Hayward-Wright, who is our Programmatic and Sustainability Advisor. So Drew, over to you.
Thanks, Helen, and thanks, Lauren, and thanks everyone for joining today. As mentioned, my name's Drew. I'm the Programmatic and Sustainability Advisor for IAB Europe and have been involved in setting up the IAB Europe Sustainability Standards Committee. Today, I'm going to take you through an overview first of the lay of the land of sustainability in digital advertising and its importance, and then also just touch on the IAB Europe's Sustainability Standards Committee, or the kind of progress that's been made, work to come in the future. But setting the scene a little bit, it's no surprise that sustainability and the climate crisis is a massive topic. Good reason. Emissions have continued to rise since the early 1950s or mid-1900s at a really exponential rate, only declining slightly in recent years due to a decrease in international travel brought on by COVID-19 pandemic, but we are starting to see that increase again. And it's always important to remember when we're talking about the climate crisis, but also sustainability in general, that it's not something that cares about geographical borders. It doesn't care what company you work in, what political alignment you have. It is a global issue. And we always need to keep that in mind, that when we're making decisions, we need to think about the macro and the micro, the company or individual, but also the wider impact on society as well. And at this point, I just wanted to touch on, I mentioned it just then, it's important to remember that sustainability is far bigger than just carbon emissions and the impact on the weather. We often get what's called carbon tunnel vision, but we forget that there are 17 sustainability goals from the United Nations, from no poverty through to clean water and life on land, and number 13 being climate action. But I did hear a very good point last week, actually, that we should laser focus in on climate action because of the compounding impacts that it has with the global temperatures increasing on the rest of the sustainability goals. For example, increase in poverty and hunger could occur if there's drought and famine brought on by climate change. So we definitely, absolutely, as an industry and society, need to focus on reducing those carbon emissions. And it's important that we act as an industry, that whilst governments are taking action, we've had COP26 in Glasgow and COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, there was a resounding factor that whilst government and policymakers are setting targets, a lot of burden and emphasis is going to fall on industry, private sectors and organisations to innovate, change business practices and technologies that they use in order to reduce their emissions and get to those targets that are being set by government and policymakers. And our industry is no exception to this. As Lauren previously just mentioned, that the internet is a large global footprint of CO2 emissions from 2 up to 4%, putting us on par with the aviation industry, and it's going to grow. Currently, there's 4.66 billion users of the internet worldwide, and obviously if they're using internet, they're seeing digital ads, so there is a carbon footprint there as well. A study recently found that a campaign from a single advertiser could produce approximately 322 tons of CO2, or equivalent to around 160 round trips between Paris and New York. When we talk about that kind of stat there, that is including a lot of different factors, not just the delivery of digital ads, but also the production and other elements. So the number that Laura mentioned, 5.4 tons, is more focused on the actual delivery. When you look at the whole impact of digital advertising from start to finish, it is even bigger. But in order for us to understand what needs to be done, we need to look at the internet as a supply chain. And the best way that I find is to break it down into these kind of 5 buckets, where we're passing data and information from point A to point B along this supply chain, whether it be a bid request, a cookie sync, the actual creative asset that travels from data centers across the internet core networks, network delivery, access networks from the telcos, and to the end user's device. And each of these points in the supply chain consumes energy and therefore produces potential CO2 emissions. And these emissions are going to, as I mentioned, grow because of the size of the internet, but also because of 3 core factors. There's an explosion of video consumption. So viral video consumes more, transfers more data and information, therefore consumes more energy and produces more CO2. A growing shift to the mobile internet, and mobile internet being available in developing countries. The mobile internet is more energy consuming than a fixed broadband, so the telco networks that need to be used. And then the last one is high user expectations. As device screen resolution improves, as users expect faster, more instant load experiences, there also comes an energy consumption cost there with those as well, but also an expectation for businesses to meet these high user expectations. I think gone are the days where users would talk about attention spans. If the site is not loading instantaneously, they're going to bounce and go browse somewhere else. And it's important to remember that whilst I made that comparison to the aviation industry, where many of us know if we fly, it produces more CO2 emissions than, say, getting a train or driving by car or even walking. The internet isn't tangible like that aviation or airline travel. It's a thing in many of our pockets, in day-to-day users' pockets, that's just there. They don't associate energy consumption. They don't associate CO2 emissions with the use of the internet. Society is geared towards more and more consumption, more and more page views, swipes. So therefore, if we're going to create an impact, change is going to have to come from within our industry. We're going to have to look at behavioral changes. We're going to have to look at technological changes in order to reduce the overall CO2 emissions of our industry. And the good news is that we have started to take action. You're going to hear from James at The Guardian today, so he can speak more about their efforts, but there is a lot of other initiatives from, obviously, the IB Europe Sustainability Standards Committee. We're seeing advertisers lean in, and we're seeing new tech innovations being produced. And it's important to see that the narrative that is emerging, and you'll hear it time and again, is this approach of measure, reduce, and offset. And it's really important we start doubling down and focusing on that reduction element. We will not, as an industry and as a society, get to a point of reducing the temperature increases through offsetting alone. We need to reduce the overall CO2 emissions that we are producing as a global civilization. So what could potentially be done in order to meet this data explosion, in order to meet this energy increase of the internet? The first thing we could look at is increasing the efficiency of the infrastructure that we're using. Now, the challenge here is that the increase in infrastructure only amounts to about 13% each year. And we're seeing a growth of data and information passing across the internet at about 40% per year. So there's a delta there already. The next one on the right is the use and supply of green energy, which is an absolute amazing thing, and encourage every single organization to look at your suppliers and look at where you can shift to green energy. However, if we go back to one of my first points, where I talk about the micro and the macro, we need to consider that this is a global issue, and there simply is not enough green energy to go around. The last stat I saw was about 75% of the globe is on carbon-heavy sources when it comes to energy. So we need to find ways, therefore, if there's too much pressure on these two, to reduce the amount of data, reduce what we're sending across the internet, and look at ways in which we can optimize and reduce the overall energy consumption and therefore CO2 emissions of our digital activation. So that gives you a bit of an overview of the kind of problem today and the actions that we potentially can take as an industry. As I mentioned, we launched IB Europe Sustainability Standards Committee late last year. There is about 40 to 50 companies involved in that, and it carries on bi-weekly currently. And the reason we've launched it is that we felt there was a need to create a central point for the decarbonisation and sustainability conversation for technology providers across Europe. IB Europe, as an organisation who has had strong engagements with policy and regulation and alignment with them over the years when it comes to personal data and GDPR. It's obviously well placed in terms of that central point to help bring the conversation together and collaboration, improve collaboration. And as I mentioned, with past experience of frameworks such as TCF as well. And importantly, the last point here is that we have the audience and the members and the stakeholders ready now to take action. And one big thing that we always refer to is, like, throughout the work of the Sustainability Standards Committee is that we're not here to reinvent the wheel. We absolutely want to collaborate. We're working with national IABs to ensure that any of the great work that they're doing, which we're going to hear more from the first panel today about, is elevated and distributed at a European level and in a consistent manner as well. So what are the work streams that we've been looking at, or we're starting to look at? So there's 4 clear work streams currently in the roadmap. And the first one is definitions and policies, where we're looking at things like common standard definitions. We're then looking at a business guides. So these are practical decisions that individual organizations take, whether it be having a conversation with a new partner, through to assessing your own setup, programmatic setup. They're moving into taxonomy mapping, and this is both the industry taxonomy, but importantly, the regulatory taxonomy as well, which we need to take note of. I think one key difference that we see when it comes to sustainability versus if we say GDPR is that the regulators are ahead of us as an industry when it comes to sustainability and regulation. There's a lot of regulation out there for other industries. So it's a very different landscape than when it comes to sort of GDPR regulation, and where regulators have brought in and are trying to adapt to a quite evolved landscape. And the last one is methodology and database, looking and understanding what is already in existence and what is required by regulators in order for measurement, reporting, and then onward journey to hopefully reducing the amount of energy and carbon emissions of our supply chain. So a little bit of a quick sample in terms of the work to date that we have done in that Sustainability Standards Committee. The first thing that we launched was the State of Readiness survey at the start of this year. We had over 200 respondents to this, so thank you for those organisations that did respond. And it was really good to see that sustainability ranked in the top 3 focuses of organisations. Obviously, me personally would love to see it up at number 1, but 26% of organisations had it as their top priority. We've also seen 55% of the industry start in some way, shape or form on their CO2 reduction journey, which is really positive to see. The question now is, how can we get the remaining 45% of the industry to start considering and taking action, as we all have seen is really required. I do encourage you to download and read that. It's up online, free to download, load of useful insights just to give you a lay of the land as to where our industry is on that journey. And then the most recent release has been a common definition of sustainability. The reason we started here, it seems like it's very grassroots and back to basics, but we think that we need a good foundation so that we're all talking about the same language. This definition of sustainability recognizes that there are 3 factors of sustainability when we're talking about it: environmental, social, and economic, that we need to consider when we're making sustainable decisions. And as I mentioned, contributed by over 40 different organisations across the ad industry. There's a load more work being done on practical business decisions that's hopefully coming out in the not too distant future. So do stay tuned, because there'll be more information coming shortly. So with that, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate the opportunity to talk you all through sustainability and digital advertising. If you do have any questions, as always, please feel free to get in touch with myself and Lauren. We're happy to answer any questions. So with that, we'll invite the first panel up, and I will stop sharing.